Okay, so this is a video that goes over your Module 3A quant exercise. Again, the idea is shortly after the assignment is due, I make available the key just in a document form and also in this video form. So hopefully the idea is that as shortly after the assignment is due, you have an opportunity to kind of go over the answers essentially with me, and you can get your questions answered or reinforce what you already did. Okay, so basically speaking, this quant exercise was simply practice of calculating marginal utility from given data, and then calculating the ratio of marginal utility to price for given data, and then interpreting both those ideas. So roughly speaking, what you have here is just, even though the Google form had a slightly different format, what you're being asked to do is just, you're just being asked to, get the pen here, calculate this column and this column for the X goods and the Y goods. Okay, so again, straight up calculation. You're not really necessarily having to understand a lot. It's just the practice of those calculations. Okay, and essentially that's all the quant exercise is doing. So let's, can I move on? Okay, let's move to the next slide. All right, so what we have here is the blank table. Again, that was what was provided on the Google form. And what I will actually do is move on to the next slide, which is repeated form. And the idea is just to show, kind of working backwards, how these numbers were generated. Again, because all the answers are here for that marginal utility and the ratio of marginal utility to price for both good X and good Y, I don't have to go through every single cell. The key is just to show how these numbers were generated. Okay, so first of all, what we're doing here is, first of all, because we're dealing with a marginal concept, the marginal utility, we're talking about change when we're going from a certain level of quantity to a new level of quantity. So I'm asking you to calculate marginal utility from going from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, etc. So that means as you're calculating marginal utility, you're going to need to look at differences, okay? So let me give myself a little more space here maybe. All right, so if we're calculating the ratio of, if we're calculating marginal utility going from 0 to 1 for good X, marginal utility is simply the change in total utility over the change in the amount of the good. Okay? So not too much space there. So change in total utility and going from 0 to 1 is 50. So when we consume 1 unit of the good, that generates a total utility of 50. When we consume no units of the good, our total utility is 0. So it's 50 minus 0 divided by 1. So the amount of the good that generates 50 is 1, and the amount of the good that generates 0 units of utility is 0. So our marginal utility is 50, which is that number. Okay, so we can do this again in going from 1 to 2, right? So that's our 1 to 2 is dealing with the denominator, and the total utility at 1 is 50. Total utility at 2 is 88. So our marginal utility is going to be equal to 88 minus 50. So the change in the total utility divided by the change in the amount of the good consumed. So 2 minus 1, and we get 38, which is that. So if you just keep doing that, as you go down, you'll see you should kind of confirm that you get these particular values. Okay? So next item is the interpretation. So again, I just asked the question in the quant exercise on the Google form, interpret the value of the marginal utility of y when moving from 8 to 9. So when we're moving from 8 to 9, we're talking about from here to here, and the change, the marginal utility in moving from 8 to 9 was 16, okay? So what that means is, and I have it here, since the value of the marginal utility is 16, I'm just kind of giving a little preface there. The interpretation would be that, and so this is the key thing, if you increase your consumption of good Y by 1 unit, it's always by 1 unit, your utility would increase by 16 units. So when interpreting these values, whenever you're talking about a marginal, any sort of marginal, you have to talk about adding one more thing and how that changes something else. So let me just, so marginal utility of Y was 16. So that's saying if you increase your consumption of Y by 1 unit, then your total utility, or your utility, would increase by 16 units of Y. I'm sorry, 16 units of utility, okay? So if you increase your consumption of Y by 1 unit, you increase your total utility by 16 units of utility, okay? So let's see, let's look at the ratio of marginal utility to price. So in terms of calculations, this is very easy, because what you're doing is, because you're talking about the ratio of marginal utility to price for good X, all you're doing is you're taking, let's say from 0 to 1, you're taking that 50, that value of marginal utility that you already calculated, and dividing it by the price of the good. So 50 divided by 3 equals 16.67. When we go from 1 to 2, ratio of marginal utility to price, you've already calculated that marginal utility, 38, dividing it by the same price again. So 38 divided by 3 equals 12.67, and then in going from 2 to 3, we've already calculated the ratio, we've already calculated the marginal utility of going from 2 units of good X to 3 units of good X, and we showed that to be 33, and then divided by the price of X, which is 3, and that gives us 11. So again, you can go all the way down here and confirm these values. Once you've calculated that marginal utility, you're just dividing it by the price of the good to get that ratio of marginal utility to price. Okay, calculation is pretty clear. Now when we get to the interpretation, this is where it's a little different. It's essentially what we're doing, ratio of marginal utility to price is, well, let's just look at the answer. So interpret the value of the ratio of marginal utility to price when moving from Y equals 8 to Y equals 9. So again, we're talking about what's happening to the ratio of marginal utility to price as we go from 8 to 9. We calculated that value to be 5.33. Let me just scroll up so you can see this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the column that shows ratio of marginal utility to price. We got that divided by 16, divided by the price of 3 is 3, and that gives us 5.33. Okay, so the question is, if that value is 5.33, the ratio of marginal utility to price, how do we interpret that? So I'll just read through. Again, we have this, since the value of the, I'm just reading the question, the answer here. Since the value of the ratio, that's a typo, ratio of marginal utility to price is 5.33, I'm just restating the question essentially. Okay, the interpretation would be that if you increase your spending on good by $1 more, okay, so we're getting back to that, marginal idea of doing one more of something, your utility would increase by 5.33 units. So doing one more, how does something change? Okay? So again, if we're looking at interpreting this value and looking at the ratio, what does this one represent? It's talking about if we spend one more dollar on good Y, what change is that going to generate? It's going to add to our total utility by 5.33. Now the typical mistake is to say, oh, if we spend one more dollar on good Y, we're going to increase our marginal utility by 5.33. That is incorrect. On the video, and probably I'll reinforce in class again, the algebra that shows when you actually kind of do this, a little bit of algebra regarding the marginal utility divided by the price, what you get is this idea of, it becomes clear the interpretation is add one more dollar, your total utility increases by 5.33. Okay? So again, just want you to practice the interpretations, practice the calculations, and in class we'll get a little more clarification in person of how is it that we interpret this ratio this way. Okay, so that should do it. Hopefully this answers some questions or helps you prepare some questions for class.